Brian Peugeot,
Brian Peugeot, present virtually from Holland, Michigan.
Tim Hemingway,
Tim Hemingway, virtually from Holland, Michigan.
Boyd Feltman,
Boyd Feltman, present virtually from Holland, Michigan.
oh, now it's juggling on me. Jeff Christians,
Present virtually from Holland, Michigan.
Nikki Aronshorst,
Nikki Aronshorst, present virtually from Holland, Michigan.
PJ Thompson,
PJ Thompson, present virtually from Holland, Michigan.
and I think those are all of our Travis Williams.
I was going to let that one ride.
Yeah.
Travis Williams attending virtually from Holland, Michigan.
All right, Travis, you can give me a hard time about that later, but
I was going to say that's the only way Keith can take pot shots at Travis publicly is just to skip over him and roll call.
oh yeah, I tell you. All right, we have a quorum, Mr. Chair.
All right. Thank you, Keith. Appreciate it. We have a fun meeting today. I'm excited about this one. We got some special guests. We're going to learn about RECs and carbon offsets. And then we're also going to hear from Joe at the ODC a little bit later regarding benchmarking. So full slate. The agenda's a little flip-flopped. We're doing all the stock stuff at the end, and the new education learning stuff at the beginning, which is good. So we have to kick things off with approving the meeting minutes from last time. I think I can never remember. Do we discuss before or do we motion first?
Motion to approve.
Thanks, Tim. Do I have a second?
Second.
Thank you, Travis. Is there any discussion around the meeting minutes from last time?
Just one minor spelling correction of Mika Weiss's name. It's not Moran Weiss, it's Mika.
Okay.
M-E-I-K-A. Yes.
That's because that was her daughter.
Oh, that was her daughter. Okay,
Yep.
she spoke. You're right. I was like, I didn't ever heard that. Okay.
Okay.
That's great. Anything else?
Nope.
All right. All in favor of approving the meeting minutes? Aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? All right. Thank you very much. That passes. Moving on to the public comment section. We have some folks on the interwebs here. So who would like to share?
Brian, this is Don Triesenberg.
Hey, Don.
Yeah, good to hear from you. So good afternoon. My name is Don Triesenberg. I live in 29 East 6th Street in Holland. I offer these comments on behalf of the Holland Climate Collaborative. We're grateful for the work that you all are doing within the CEP Strategic Development Team and for this opportunity to offer 3 brief comments. One, thanks to Brian for his comments on the front page story of yesterday's Holland Sentinel about the work that you're doing. Among the folks we talked to at the collaborative, there's a strong interest in hearing more. Second, we really appreciate and have interest in today's topic of RECs and offsets for several reasons. One, we note that many large corporations with strong ties to our local economy use these tools. Just to mention 3, Ford, Kraft Heinz, and Steelcase. They use them on a huge scale. A brief look at the Steelcase website says that last year they planned to purchase offsets and RECs to cover 120,000 metric tons of greenhouse gas equivalent to cover their entire emissions worldwide. It's also pretty obvious when you check websites of these companies that have a strong tie to our local economy, where many of the local businesses our suppliers, their commitments to doing this is going to extend from their own operations to those of their suppliers. So that's going to put enormous pressure on a lot of our local economy as places like Ford and Kraft and Steelcase and many others step up their own carbon goals. Another reason that this is a topic of interest to us is wherever we go, we are happy to cite the cities providing leadership by example in terms of purchasing its own RECs for the city's use of electricity. I would like to urge the city to use that as a leadership opportunity and to broadcast that more publicly. And lastly, we're beginning to wonder in the collaborative if there might be some creative ways to offer RECs and offset opportunities to residents while preserving the economies of scale that large corporations get when they make their purchases. And a final comment, on this day of honoring Dr. Martin Luther King, the collaborative reminds itself and you that roughly 40% of our Holland families are what are called ALICE families, asset limited, income constrained, and employed. ALICE people here and around the world tend to be most impacted by the harm of climate change, to which we all contribute. But they often lack, by definition, the capital that you and I have to benefit from the CEP programs that encourage, for example, home energy retrofits or the purchase of electric vehicles. So 3 points and I'm done. Thank you for listening.
Thanks, Don.
Thanks, Don.
Anyone else like to jump in? All right, I'll give it 3 more seconds in case you think you're talking, but you're on mute. Okay, great. Appreciate that. And in addition to those sentiments, we have received a number of online public comments, which our committee has been made aware of over the last week, and I'm sure we've all read in great detail. And we do have to have a vote to acknowledge them as part of the public record of the meeting. So if I could have a motion to acknowledge those written comments, that would be great.
So moved.
Thank you, Boyd. And Tim,
Support.
with the support. Thank you, sir. Any commentary on the public comments that were submitted? I don't know if that's normal, but anyone want to say anything about them?
Well, this is Tim. I did read all of them, and one from Peter Bogart had some good points within there, and we appreciate that input from the community.
Yeah, Peter wrote a new community energy plan, I think.
Well, he broke it down into suggested targets, the four that he had listed in his attached document, and there again, I thank Peter for submitting that, and so that we have that as part of our considerations as we move forward.
Yeah.
He should be on this team.
I think we're all carrying a little bit of Peter in our hearts one way or another.
Yeah.
There you go.
Great. Any other comments from the submitted online? Okay, great. Then if I could get a quick vote, all in favor of approving?
Aye.
Any opposed? All right, that passes as well. So great. That takes us right up to number 4 on the agenda, our our guests today, Ben Massey from Blue Source and Mike Trupis from Foresight Management, are here to ham and egg a conversation around renewable energy certificates and carbon offsets. They are both experts in these areas and are a wealth of knowledge. I know them both pretty well. And I've asked them to do a 101 for us. I think it's really important that we all are learning this stuff together at the same time. And these instruments are, if anytime you see a big headline goal related to net zero or carbon neutrality, what they're going to talk about today are always a part of the mix to some degree or another. So yeah, I'll let them introduce themselves and say a quick minute about why, you might want to be paying attention to them. I think they have a presentation, so I'm not sure who. Ben, have you given that to someone, or do you need to be able to share?
I've got the presentation up. If you want to, if you can give me presenting rights, I'm happy to do that, or I can just send it to whoever wants to share.
What's the process on that, Keith?
I tried to. Oh, here we go. Somebody enabled it. So yeah.
Yeah, I think Becky can let
Yep.
that happen.
Okay.
Becky's managing that in the background. There we go.
Great.
Thanks, Becky.
Awesome. All right, guys, take it away.
Let me know. I'm going to put it in presenter mode here. Oh, you probably see the wrong. Wait, which one do you see? The full screen or my notes side?
No, we see
got
the
the
notes
notes.
one.
We have the notes.
I have both.
How about now?
Yep,
Full
Great.
screen.
Looks good.
that's the one.
Okay.
Nailed it.
All right.
Well, thanks again for inviting us. So a little background, if you don't like this presentation, Brian Peugeot is my colleague, so you can make sure to take it up with him. Sorry, I couldn't help but put that in there. But again, just some framing. I'll be taking you through renewable energy credits, or RECs, and then Ben will be taking you through carbon offsets. And the reason why we wanted to split it between two people is because far too often people can get these two concepts confused or use them synonymously when they're quite different. And so we just wanted to make sure that they were coming from two different people so that you could have, in some regards, two different perspectives, but also understand that there's quite a bit of a difference between a REC and a carbon offset. Before we jump into that, I do want to just go to the next slide and show you one piece to kind of frame this conversation. You might be saying, well, why are we talking about this, or why is this material at this point in time? And I think that we're starting to see a real trend towards consideration of the climate just in all decisions. And I think one thing that happened in 2020 that may have been overshadowed by this virus that's been going around is a guy named Larry Fink, who's the CEO of BlackRock Capital. BlackRock is the largest asset manager in the globe. And he came out in January of 2020, just before COVID, and actually basically came out and said that climate risk is investment risk. And it's been basically a year now since that statement has come out. And we have seen collectively in the energy and environmental industry, those ripple effects really manifesting themselves in not only corporations, which is obviously who he was targeting as a major shareholder of basically all the publicly traded companies, but actually down into things like municipalities and even individual investors and individual people. And so I think it's valuable for Holland to understand these are trends that are moving in a specific direction. And what Ben and I are going to talk about today are basically the first steps, or the ways you can dip your toes into coming up with a plan around both RECs and carbon offsets. So we'll jump into some definitions. Before I do that, I do want to say the difference between a REC and a carbon offset is a REC is specific to electricity and electric power. A carbon offset is offsetting any source of carbon. So if you think about it, a coal-fired power plant would certainly emit carbon, and you could offset that with carbon offsets, or you could buy a REC. However, driving your car burns gasoline, which emits carbon. There's no RECs for gasoline or for car driving. That would be specific to a carbon offset. So that's the big differential between the two. I'm going to take you through just a couple of these definitions. I believe we'll have this presentation for you afterwards. But initially, this presentation was made for a number of different electricity offset instruments, but we're going to focus on RECs because they're the most approachable. But I wanted to leave all the definitions in. The first thing we need to consider, though, when we're looking at RECs or any sort of electricity offset is this idea of additionality. And this idea of additionality actually will spill over into carbon offsets as well. And Ben will talk about these considerations for carbon. But the concept of additionality answers this question. And the question is, does my decision add renewable assets to the grid in the case of RECs? So if you can answer yes to that question, then there is that additionality. So I'll give you two examples. If my decision to put solar panels on my house, does that add renewable assets to the grid? The short answer is yes. I'm going out and I am purchasing solar panels and I'm putting them on my roof, and that's adding more assets to the grid. So the answer there would be it has perfect additionality. Let's say there's a wind turbine that's a farm that's operating down in Texas, and I choose to buy renewable energy credits or RECs from that asset down in Texas. It's already been constructed. It was constructed 10 years ago and it's running. My decision to purchase RECs doesn't offer additionality directly. And the reason why is because that wind turbine is already there. It's already generating electricity. My decision to buy the RECs off of it doesn't actually add any additional assets to the grid. However, and this was aptly pointed out actually by Dave when we were discussing this a little bit ago, is just because it doesn't have direct additionality considerations doesn't mean that your decision doesn't impact the market. So what I'm saying there is, if everyone continued to purchase RECs, the demand for RECs would increase, and if there was still a static supply of them, then the price would go up. And as prices go up, that would actually incent developers to construct additional assets. So again, additionality, there's multiple layers to it, but again, the overall concept is, am I doing something that's going to add stuff to the grid or not? The other consideration for RECs especially is this concept of bundled versus unbundled. And again, one in some regards is considered more acceptable and better than the other, but they're both have their value in place. So for bundled, what you're doing is you're buying your electricity and your REC from the same source. So if I were able to go into an agreement and buy electricity from a wind turbine in the thumb of Michigan and purchase the electricity and purchase that REC, that would be a bundled electricity product, and I could buy them both. Unbundled could be an example of I'm buying electricity from just the local natural gas power plant down the street, and I then go buy RECs from maybe an asset in Oklahoma. That would be unbundled. In both cases, from a market standpoint, I'm buying 100% renewable electricity. But obviously there's considerations in, did I buy it from the same source or not? So that's the idea of bundled versus unbundled. I don't want to spend any more time digging into the other pieces because they're getting a lot further down the road on this discussion of renewable energy credits. So we'll jump right into the next slide. So let's talk about RECs. RECs are the most approachable of the options you have for renewable electricity. The other options that are available are listed in the middle of this slide, and I'll just briefly go over them. So green rates and tariffs are things you could buy from like the Holland BPW or other electric utilities across the country. Basically, they are purchasing RECs and using those to offset their electricity and selling that electricity in the offset to you. So they function very similar to RECs. Power purchase agreements and virtual power purchase agreements are you actually going out and doing a deal where you contract to buy the offtake of a renewable a renewable asset somewhere in the country. And then on-site generation is pretty self-explanatory. You generate energy on site. You go buy a bunch of solar panels and you put them on your roof and you have renewable energy. All of these decisions result in renewable energy, but again, they all carry different considerations. You can see on the left, there's additionality considerations, and on the right, there's risk and cost considerations. So from a additionality, risk and cost standpoint, RECs are the lowest of all of them. They carry the least amount of additionality because generally you're buying RECs from an existing asset, but they also carry very minimal risk and cost because you could choose to buy RECs this week for electricity that you consumed last year or this year. And then you may say in a year, that didn't go so well, I don't want to do it again. And you can be done. You could choose to just buy RECs for a year. You can contract for any length of time longer than that as well. But again, it carries minimal cost and risk, and you can just choose not to. Obviously, if you spend significant capital to put solar panels on your roof, one, it's a lot more cost, but there's also risk in that. You know, what happens if electricity prices change drastically? But again, you get the maximum amount of additionality. So again, we just want to make sure we're being clear on what RECs are and what RECs aren't. The reason why RECs are generally included in basically every discussion is because of the fact that they are so low risk and so low cost. They're very easy to move on. And so when you hear large companies, so Don mentioned that there's a number of large companies that are making commitments to going like 100% renewable electricity or zero carbon. On the electricity side, many big organizations, especially the really big ones like in the tech ones like Google and Amazon and Facebook, they're using a suite of all of these things. They're doing on-site generation, they're doing power purchase agreements, they're doing some green rates and tariffs. They're also buying RECs to fill in the rest. So there's basically a mixture of a strategy. However, a lot of companies who are just dipping their toes in, they're just getting started. Many times they will start with just saying, we know how much electricity we used and we're gonna just do a REC buy that covers 100% of that now. And then we're gonna start investing in these other things as we go. So again, RECs are generally considered the most approachable of all the renewable electricity options.
Mike, can you go back to RECs for a second? I'm a little confused on the market. What is the market? Who are the players in the market for RECs? Individual versus corporation? Are there brokers involved? Just a little bit more about that part of it.
Yeah, actually, that's great. So the people who are creating the RECs or supplying the RECs are generally your developers. So if you're a developer, you're going out and you're building, again, let's call it a big wind turbine farm out in Oklahoma. And so you have this electricity and you're selling that electricity, generally speaking, into the grid. And so if you don't have a bundled product where Google said, we're going to pay you to 100% of your electricity and your RECs, then that obviously never hits the market. But if you build it and you're selling electricity into the grid, then you have these RECs. And so what happens, Boyd, is then you take those RECs as a developer and you can, generally you're selling those to brokers. Sometimes you can find end consumers, and we have helped companies do deals directly with developers, but many times the developer, because they don't have access to end consumers, they will sell them to like brokers or other people. And then brokers are sitting there buying different types of RECs. They'll buy wind RECs, they'll buy solar RECs, they'll buy other types of RECs like hydropower or other things like that. They can buy all those, and then they also go out to all these big companies who've made commitments and said, hey, we offer all these different products, you can purchase them. And then to like the volume, maybe some of the volume question, again, most transactions for RECs are done by corporates or by like municipalities and like larger organizations. It's not that common for individuals to transact. Again, to Don's point earlier, it's very expensive to do a REC purchase of maybe like 5 or 10 RECs, which would be about what you max would need for like an individual household. So usually you're not getting reasonable pricing until you're 10,000 plus. And this is the same thing with carbon offsets. The pricing is best had when you hit economies of scale because there's just minimum costs to transact. Does that answer the question? Any other questions around that?
Yeah, is there an aftermarket for trading RECs as well, or is it held to maturity?
It can be traded again, but there are instruments to ensure that they're not duplicated. So what happens is if you're the end buyer of a REC, you do what's called retire that REC. And so that's put on a public ledger. And generally, the organization that certifies all the RECs in America is called Green E. So if you really, the gold standard, if you want to buy a quality REC, you're buying a Green E certified REC. And what happens then is they certify it. And then once you take title to it, you can retire it. And you can only claim renewable attributes when you've retired those set of RECs. So there is accountability around it. This isn't just like making things up. The best way I like to think of it is like gold. Back when we were on the gold standard for money. So before we got off the gold standard, they had a bunch of gold in Fort Knox, and then they printed an equivalent amount of dollar bills that were representative of the gold. So instead of you going to a store and chipping off some gold dust and paying for something, you handed them a dollar note, and that note said it was backed by gold at a safe. You handed them that certificate, that dollar, and you got your goods. RECs function the same way. Those assets could be producing renewable energy anywhere in the country, but you as the title holder of that certificate are the one who can actually claim the renewable attribute.
Hey, Mike, can you also just mention the fact that, like Michigan, for example, has a renewable energy standard And therefore,
Yep.
there's a constraint on the available supply for this market. And so there are different markets even within RECs.
Yeah, that's a great point, Dave. So the term is RPS, or Renewable Portfolio Standards. So each state, I believe there's something like 35 or 40 now that have implemented renewable portfolio standards. Michigan, is it at 20, Dave? 20%?
Michigan is at 15, but then it
15.
also puts requirements on where the actual generator is located. So Oklahoma,
Yes.
for example, wouldn't qualify
Correct.
in Michigan.
So the generation mix of the state of Michigan has to be at least 15% renewable. That's Michigan's renewable portfolio standard right now. So again, to Dave's point, if Michigan were to pass, say, a 20 or 25% RPS, you would see a regional increase in REC pricing for Michigan, because there would, again, supply and demand, there'd be a lot more demand for those RECs. And then obviously there would be developers that would want to come in and construct more assets. So yes, you can buy RECs anywhere you want in the country. The lowest price RECs are generally down in like Texas and Oklahoma. But again, a number of organizations, especially as they get more sophisticated, look to purchase their RECs closer to home, and again, in the electric grid that they're operating their operations in.
Mike, the RPS is really only about utilities, though,
Yep.
and how things are generated. It's not, it's not like tracking how many RECs relative to total energy usage across the state. It's not doing that.
That's correct. What I'm talking about here more is geared towards the voluntary offset market. So again, there's no renewable portfolio standard for Microsoft. They just chose as a company to be 100% renewable energy and have chosen to purchase stuff. So they can buy whatever they want. If they decided we only want to buy Oklahoma wind RECs, they could just buy Oklahoma wind RECs. Yeah, people might push back, but that would, from a market standpoint, be a way to implement 100% renewable energy. Again, to Dave's point, a utility, if they're in Michigan and they have to follow the RPS, they would have to buy Michigan RECs. Go ahead.
Unpack that statement though for us a little bit, Mike. Who would push back, and why would someone push back on Microsoft doing that? Like what's going on there?
There's environmental organizations. So generally the pushback doesn't come when you make an announcement. That is you trying to figure things out. But what happens is a lot of times is companies that have stagnated in their goals, I think that's where they frequently will get more pushback. And the pushback is from your standard environmental organizations. And honestly, pushback comes a lot from just general consumers, where they sit here and say, yeah, I mean, you're doing these things. You can read through people's published reports. You might say, yeah, you're doing these things, but the reality is you haven't really like upped your goals in a while. And all these investments you made were 10 years ago and nothing's really changed.
So within the context of a company could be 100% renewable energy, but within that, there could be different levels of varying people's perspectives on like how authentic that is, or it's in the eye of the beholder is what I'm saying.
Certainly, if you want to get in the rabbit hole, like Google has said that they want to buy 100% renewable electricity that equals the time that they're consuming the electricity on the grid. So again, I'll just make up a number. If you use a million kilowatt hours worth of electricity in the year and you buy a million kilowatt hours worth of RECs, it all's even. They're saying we want RECs that were generated at the same time as when we were consuming the electricity, so they perfectly match. So there's standards that can get really high, and mostly tech companies can follow these because they have the capital and the resources and the ability. But
and if I can interject on that, I think, and kudos on their part, because, the more that buy just to buy the RECs, don't really add an appreciation to the fact that the grid must balance load and supply all the time. And so those that are actually trying to line those things up are not putting pressure or burden on the grid versus those that have no real care about what time the electricity is generated. And as more renewables get added, that just adds an issue with being able to sync up the grid supply and demand and not have problems from an operational standpoint with too high of a penetration of renewable resources.
Yep, it's a great point, Dave.
Mike, I'm sorry, I don't want to slow us down too much. I'm fascinated. I'm tracking you.
Sure.
Again, financial geek here. So 2 financial questions on this. So back to tradability. Are you saying that between corporations that own, and as their demand changes, there's not a market for liquidity right now where one corporation may sell their RECs to another corporation, bring up liquidity on one side, the other one then achieves? Is there nothing going on right
Sorry,
now?
I'm not saying that. My apologies. As I understand it, if you don't retire it, you can sell it again. It's sorry. What I
Okay.
was getting at is when it's retired, that's when the liquidity goes away because then you can actually claim the attribute.
Okay. So is it a very active market, do you know, between buyers and sellers, those in demand and those who have excess?
No, because it's pretty niche product, and it's mostly back to Dave's point. It's mostly voluntary at this point. So if we're talking about the corporates, they'll go out, they'll shop the market, they'll say, okay, and this is the common time to do it. So they know how much electricity they consumed in 2020, and you can still buy 2020 RECs now, 2020 vintage RECs. They'll go out and they'll shop the market, say we need 10,000 RECs. They'll go shop a bunch of different either direct developers or brokers, and then whoever gives them the best price for whatever they're looking for, generally they'll just go transact and then they'll retire them because they need to put that in their report. So I think there's a lot of opportunity for some of the trades, but the reality is the market doesn't actually flow all that much because you're usually just buying it and consuming it or retiring it right away. There's not a lot of people, there may be on the brokerage side, who are buying and selling them all the time or trying to get them from assets and speculating.
Yeah.
But at the end point, companies are just buying them and retiring them.
Mm-hmm. What's the typical duration of a certificate?
I'm not exactly. It's annually. So it's the certificate. It gets certified for a specific vintage. So the 2020 vintage, you have to show that your asset generated that REC in 2020.
Okay, so it's a short-term asset. That helps explain too why there might not be much of a market. And then from a regulation,
RPSs have different rules on that too. Like Michigan's, you can have a 3-year life, for example, before it's gone. So it just depends on how the regulatory environment. But if you look at, they are very short-term in terms of.
Got it. And then the last one is just regulation. Dave just touched on it. Is this a financial instrument? Is it regulated by the SEC or is it EPA? Is it shadow here? I don't know what this is, how mature it is.
It depends. So the short answer is it depends. You can go direct to a developer and contract without basically any due diligence. Again, when you talk about regulation, you get like Green E certification. So there are third-party certifiers. Okay. Dave could probably answer better how the actual RPS ones function. But again, in the just general voluntary market, most companies are only going to buy stuff that's been third-party certified. You can go and buy contract direct. And if you feel good about that and can defend that, then that functions as well.
Yeah, those RPSs, like in Michigan, they have an entity that is responsible for qualifying the asset as being a qualified renewable asset.
Okay.
And then there's another separate entity that actually is charged with verifying the metering data showing the actual production from that asset. So you have that, that additional stamp of, legitimacy associated with that production.
Thanks, Dave. Yeah, that helps a lot.
Yeah, and it's a little weird, Boyd, because it's two worlds. There's the RPS world, and then there's the basically the voluntary world, and they do function differently. Mm-hmm. Okay, so this go ahead.
Sorry, this is Ted. You can have assets, a wind farm, for example, that are qualified in multiple states as well. So Wildcat, for instance, our wind farm in Indiana is also qualified as a REC in New Jersey and Pennsylvania and New York.
Because I'm guessing it's on the PJM grid, so it's
Correct.
able to be used anywhere in PJM. That's just basically an electrical grid operator in a region.
Okay. So Dave, these are private certification organizations, not state, federal regulatory oversight then?
Well, no, the state of Michigan, for example, has created an entity to actually certify the RECs and do those functions. And so they ultimately are accountable to the state. So now in terms of the RPSs, some of these other programs, may have different authorizations and established rules and things like that. But in terms of satisfying the regulatory environment in Michigan, that's a construct that the state of Michigan's government has oversight of.
Okay.
For all the corporate stuff, Boyd, I mean, especially if you went back 5 or 10 or 15 years, I mean, it was really wild west on the corporate,
Oh yeah.
And it's less so now, but even just anecdotally, like we had Mike and I, we have a client based in Wisconsin. They're a global $8 billion a year company. And they were thinking that they were going to be like signing a deal. And I mean, they didn't even have like legal and finance involved. They were so ignorant of what they were actually considering signing up for. And that wasn't all that long ago. So there is still some of that, but most of it is pretty lock solid. I mean, anything you're seeing out of like local companies, like a Steelcase or a Herman Miller or anybody like that, that's not real fishy.
Right.
So this diagram is basically endemic of what we just talked about. So the concept is you can't segregate what electrons you get. There are the grid, basically all the electricity mixes. So you have brown power sources and green power sources all dumping electricity into the grid. You as an end consumer can't just pick, I only want the green electrons to flow through my meter. They all get mixed together. That's where the RECs come in. You're actually then purchasing the renewable attribute from a source upstream. And we've covered that ad nauseum, but this picture illustrates how RECs actually function.
Good.
All right, and then the last thing I have for you, and then we'll jump into carbon offsets, is just some nuts and bolts on, like, you might be wondering, well, what does a REC cost? How does it work? All these other things. So right now, and the market does move, to Boyd's point, it doesn't move like wildly. It has, in some regards, actually moved somewhat wildly this year. We've seen RECs go from basically $1 a megawatt hour all the way up to $2. So that's a pretty vicious swing. Before that, they were pretty sleepy. They were moving anywhere from 80 cents to $1.20 for a while. Anyway, so basically what that translates to is about a 2 to 3% cost of your electricity. So if you're a big corporate, you're spending likely somewhere in the neighborhood of $70 to $100 a megawatt hour for electricity. So you can buy RECs at 2 to 3% of the cost of your electricity. So you can offset all of your electricity consumption as a corporate, as a large buyer, for 2 to 3% of your total cost. This is all ballpark figures. And again, that $1.75 is a wholesale purchase. Like, you're not going to get that for 5 RECs. You're only going to get that if you're buying 20,000 or so plus RECs. And then we covered all these other ones. Again, it's the least expensive. It's the fastest. So again, you can still claim 100% renewable energy in 2020 by buying RECs today. So it's quite quick to transact on. And if you didn't have a good experience, you don't have to buy them next year. So they're very simple and approachable. And then, I think that's really the big things. And even to Don's point earlier, when he was talking, he mentioned this idea of like Holland doing something around aggregating a REC purchase. That's absolutely a good way to go, just because, like I mentioned, individual consumers just don't get very favorable pricing. You really have to be at a corporate level or like a city level before you're really going to get the pricing that I'm talking about here for RECs. If you want to buy individual ones, you're probably $5 a REC or more.
Dave, would the utility purchase RECs, or would it be the city that would need to purchase them, or would it the Holland Energy Fund? I'm just trying to figure out who's the acquirer still in our situation, or is it that we're enticing our local companies to participate?
Right. So again, kind of going back to that scale that showed kind of the additive nature of the different ways of going about it, all the way from RECs down to the additionality there. Holland's program is the green rates and tariff program. So within there, we're giving people a chance, and the city and the BPW, for example, have signed up for this for our own facilities, which essentially puts an adder on the bill that represents the fact that you're getting renewable energy, you're getting the green rate. And for that, we take some of the credits that the BPW has the right to, either through purchase of RECs or through the investments in these wind farms that we've made. And there are various certificate numbers to them that we actually retire on behalf of the people who sign up for that rate. So ours is more in that rate than just a pass through of RECs. We're not really kind of managing a REC exchange for our customers. We've bundled into this green rate, this voluntary green program. Mm-hmm. So I think what has been suggested, I think, not trying to speak for Don or what Mike has said, is maybe there's a way of creating a mechanism around even just having an exchange or a buying power on the attributes for the community. That's not something we have in place today. It doesn't mean that we couldn't do that. And I think when you go back to the opportunity matrix that we'll look at later, that's some of the concept that you're going to see under the carbon offset section is being able to look at possibly creating a local program for an exchange of carbon at least. And then we of course have our voluntary green energy program that we're looking at promoting more on the electric side of it.
Yeah. So Boyd, you have two options. Basically, some industrials, like I can think of right now, Herman Miller, like we helped them buy RECs. They bought RECs directly from a broker and purchased their bulk for their entire corporate across the globe, where smaller companies, I'm sure, are buying through Dave and the Holland BPW through their green tariffs just in Holland. So there's two ways you can go about it. It's obviously is an organization's decision on if you want to say, hey, we want to offer this other option up of just straight RECs, or we're just going to encourage people to sign up through the Holland BPW's green tariff program. There are cost considerations, there's ease considerations that we can get into later, but that you have two options is basically what's going on.
Well, but there could be a third, I think, is the other thing that's getting brought up here is like, and it might not have to live in the BPW or the city. Maybe it could just be, an ODC program. There's other ways to aggregate buy. There's a lot of companies in town that are interested in looking at this stuff. And so it could just be an organizing exercise as well, right?
Yeah.
That's another.
And if I can chime in on that, Brian, I think, again, the SDT process is to try to identify the strategy that we want to pursue. And then there's a process of actually looking at how to do that. And that's where that steering committee, again, looking back at that organization chart on the community energy plan, that's where that steering committee runs a process of looking at the nuts and bolts of making it happen and actually getting that in place. So, I mean, I don't think we have to define down to the nuts and bolts. I mean, maybe you want to have some discussion around the strategy and say, yeah, this is a strategy we think the community should pursue, and we should pursue a third party, the creation of a third party to do this, or however specific you want to make that strategy definition. But I think there's going to be a process after the SDT's work of actually implementing that strategy, just as we've done every one of these cycles of creating the strategies and then implementing it. So, I'm just trying to take the pressure off you a little bit, Boyd, here to say that you have to figure out exactly how to get this done today. It's more a matter of, figuring out that you want to do this as a community. You want to recommend that, we do this process of creating an exchange program for our community to get economy of scale.
Yeah, that was my big takeaway, is that scaled by matters. There's many ways to go about that. I was curious to pick your brain there on where is the scale in our town, but the idea of could be a consortium buy, or it could be housed within city government or within utility, but scaled by, that's what matters here.
And then Boyd, I think Mike and Ben are going to outline this, right? But this is done. I'm learning right along with all of you, right? So like Mike said in the setup, a REC is different than an offset, right? So because the city and the BPW are already 100% in the green rate that we have, Dave, correct me if I'm wrong, but it's accurate to say that the city with our electric generation is like Amazon and all these other companies say, with our electric generation, we're 100% carbon neutral.
Correct. Yeah, for your electric portion of your usage.
But then we're going to have the conversation Ben's going to pick up, right, where there's the difference between your electric portion and all your other portions.
Correct.
Dave, this is, I should know this, but it's a public meeting recorded for all and for eternity. So I might as well just ask it and look dumb. What is the current, the BPW doesn't purchase RECs for all of the brown energy that you're associated with, do you? Or is
for our own usage, for our own facilities, like our service center?
No, I mean for the whole, I'm talking about can you even do that? Can you buy of all the electricity we deliver, 50% of it's green and the other 50% is brown, and we're gonna buy RECs to offset the brown.
If we did, we could do that for a strategy to meet our renewable portfolio standard obligations under the state's program. But typically our long-term power purchase agreement investments in actual renewable farms, wind farms, solar arrays, things like that have met our obligations underneath those RPS programs. But many utilities do actually buy RECs to meet the RPS requirements. So they meet up to that 15% level through actually covering brown generation with renewable energy credits.
And just so I'm breaking this down for myself and for all the listeners at home, if you were to hypothetically do that, if the BPW were to buy RECs for the entire amount of brown energy generated, then that would effectively eliminate the need for any resident or any business to buy RECs, because you've already done it. There's no point in people buying it twice. Or it doesn't need to be bought twice, correct?
Anybody that's using the power at that point would be able to say that the power is without carbon, or without, it would be essentially carbon-free power at that point.
Okay.
And I think, Brian, the question and Dave gave a good reminder to us all about the difference between the strategy and the nuts and bolts and the detail, is that I think there probably would be something that Dave would want to investigate and not speak to right now, as to, other than that limit that he talked about, if we would just go ahead and buy it and charge it to everyone, that's where you're starting to move from a voluntary program, which we know is legal, to a mandatory program, which I think we'd probably want to ask some questions about, but I think that's where you run into issues. And just because I think that's kind of what you're unpacking there, right?
Well, I'm just, it's good to name the obvious in the event that some things are not obvious. So I just wanted to hear that, the distinction, right? There's a lot of different layers and levels. And so I'm not making any suggestions. I'm just asking if what I was saying is accurate.
Yeah, that'd be accurate.
Yeah. Yep. Okay. Mike and Ben?
That's all I have for Rex. So Ben, take it away.
Thanks, Mike.
Yeah, thanks. So yeah, thanks for inviting me to present, and I'm just going to walk through some information on carbon offsets. My name is Ben Massey, and I work for BlueSource. We're the oldest and largest carbon offset project developer in North America, and we're headquartered in Salt Lake City with offices in San Francisco, Calgary, and Toronto. But I'm based in Grand Rapids. I just happen to live and work in Michigan, and I've been remote for a long time, definitely pre-COVID. So yeah, it's nice to make some connections with Brian and team and others in West Michigan, because as you can imagine, most of the work we do is outside of West Michigan, and there aren't a lot of local clients. There are some, but and then there are companies who are participating in these markets, right? And we've named some: Steelcase, Herman Miller. But so it's great to make some local connections. I'm just going to spend a couple of minutes just giving you a little bit of background on BlueSource, which I think will help as you try to understand the different players in the market. And Boyd, that maybe this goes a little bit to your question about like who's doing what brokers, traders. You're going to be able to buy these instruments, RECs and offsets, from different entities in the market. And so just breaking that down quickly. But ultimately, BlueSource endeavors to be a company's or a city's one-stop shop, right? We can help with footprinting and strategy work in our advisory group. And then we can help with the sale of instruments, right? So we develop our own projects. As mentioned, we have a couple hundred projects in several different markets and in the US and Canada. And then we also act as a retailer for carbon offsets and for RECs. So we don't develop wind projects. We don't develop renewable energy projects in general, but we can, through our network of other developers, we can source those instruments for our buyers to create a portfolio of credits. So a buyer is going to need offsets to offset, part of their emissions, and RECs to offset their electricity consumption. And so we can do all of that. So they only have to come to one place. Let's see here, move forward. There we go. Just a quick overview. The top group are companies and entities that we work with to generate carbon offsets. So these are owners of projects that have an emission reduction project, and they say, BlueSource, can you help us monetize, generate credits, offsets, and monetize them, right? Be paid for these reductions that we're taking. It's important to note that, in the context of this conversation, we work with public sector entities to develop projects. So the state of Michigan, we recently announced we're developing a forest carbon project up in the Pigeon River country on their behalf, which will generate some offsets. We work with a group of 3 cities in Massachusetts in our Massachusetts Tri-City project that's forestry, where they sort of shared, there was a community forest that they shared ownership of, and so we developed a carbon offset project on behalf of those 3 cities. So we work with both public and private sector landowner or project owners to generate credits and also to buy credits. So the bottom group is our list of some companies that are buying BlueSource carbon offsets. Some you can see a bunch of different industries, and you mentioned tech and financial industry, and so we have a very diverse set of clients, but we also have public sector clients. The city of Austin buys their carbon offsets from us to for their carbon neutrality purposes. So we also work with cities on the buy side. This is just a map of all the different projects that we develop. We develop carbon offset projects, but we also develop renewable natural gas projects too. And we don't have to spend a lot of time here other than just to note most of the projects we develop for the carbon offset markets. There are 2 markets that we've talked about for RECs and offsets, the compliance market and the voluntary market. We develop carbon offset projects for both. So there's a California compliance market for carbon. There's an Alberta compliance market for carbon, which you can see then there's a bunch of dots in Alberta, right? So those markets have much higher prices for the offsets. And so we develop projects to sell to companies in those markets, the compliance markets, if possible. Otherwise, we're developing the projects for the voluntary market. And most of the projects we develop in the US are forestry, nature-based solutions. So forestry and grasslands, sustainable agriculture is a new project type that's going to be coming online this year. So this is just a quick overview of some of the projects. And then this is important, I think, in the context of the discussion here, because how we present our philosophy, and I think in general how most stakeholders in the market view companies and entities that are trying to achieve carbon neutrality, trying to achieve emission reductions, it's really a process. It's a longer term strategy, right? It's not something that's going to happen today. And so obviously you measure and report your emissions, but you also want to identify those emission reduction opportunities internally, right? To actually reduce your emissions, because that's the ultimate goal, right? Is to get your city, your company as close to carbon neutral without RECs and offsets as possible. But we also recognize that that takes time. And so the offsets and RECs are a way to bridge that gap, achieve carbon neutrality today, on your way to those, those end goals, those emission reduction goals that you have down the road.
Mm-hmm.
So this is a slide to talk just a bit about. We started to touch on this in Mike's slides, but it's important to note what instruments are best used to offset which emissions. And so you can see here, scope 1 emissions are direct emissions from operations. So this would be, if we're thinking about the city of Holland, city vehicles, right, are going to have, those would be considered scope 1 emissions for the city. Any other sort of direct emission sources that the city controls, those are the city's scope 1 offsets. And the instruments, that's what these bars are up here, that represent the instruments that you could use to offset those emissions. And so renewable natural gas to offset gas use, natural gas use, and then offsets are an option too. For scope 2, this is all of the purchased electricity. So the city doesn't necessarily, or a company, if you think about it that way, doesn't necessarily control the power plants. They can't decide what electrons they're getting, right? As we talked about a minute ago. So this is where they would buy RECs to offset those megawatt hours of energy consumption. We also have clients who convert that into metric tons of greenhouse gases, right? So and lump it all into their larger footprint, and then buy offsets to offset all three scopes together. But RECs are really the most appropriate instrument when you think about if you're consuming a megawatt hour of brown power, you probably want to buy a megawatt hour of green power to offset that. So they're the most accurate instrument you can use. And then scope 3 is everything else. So as an example that I mentioned here, the residents of Holland driving around the city, that would be in the city's scope 3 emissions. So the city could have an impact by, through various decisions, could impact the driving of its residents, but it doesn't necessarily control them directly. And so that's just, I wanted to call that out here because it sounds like, as you guys were talking earlier, it's going to be a collaborative approach, right? The city's going to be able to do certain things. BPW is going to be able to do certain things, and residents are going to be able to do some certain things to both reduce their emissions and then offset their own emissions. And so this is just what I noted here, that a resident's emissions, they'd be their own scope 1 emissions because they control them, but it would be accounted for in the city's scope 3 emissions. So a quick note on just what is a carbon offset project, and this gets back to the additionality point that we discussed for a minute earlier, but a carbon offset is generated by actions that absorb or reduce greenhouse gases, but it has to be beyond business as usual. It has to be it has to be such that the project would not have happened in the normal course of everyday life, in the normal course of business. And that is additionality. So it means it's additional to what would have happened in business as usual. So in the unbundled REC scenario, there is no additionality. If you're buying a REC from a Texas wind farm or an Oklahoma wind farm that's been there for 15 years or 10 years, your purchase of that REC is not putting new renewable energy assets on the grid. There's that wind farm is already built, so your decision didn't affect the grid, I guess you could say. Whereas for carbon offsets, there has to be additionality. We have to prove when we're developing these projects, and it has to be verified by a third-party auditor, that this project would not have happened in the business as usual scenario. So it's really the fundamental concept of all carbon offset projects. A good example, I'll just give one example, is forestry, because that's what we're best known for. So in North America, in the US, the most common project type is called improved forest management. And that's where you take a forest that is either being commercially harvested or could be commercially harvested, and the landowner restricts the harvesting that they do well beyond business as usual, so that the trees are actually sucking up more carbon than they're emitting. And so you'd look at the business as usual case of, a certain amount of trees being cut down every year for commercial harvesting, versus what happens with the carbon project, where they don't cut down the trees and instead the trees are growing larger. And so that difference between the two emission sources or the difference between the two emission amounts is what generates the carbon offsets. And then I thought it'd be worth mentioning just a few of the key criteria, right? So each of these projects that we develop and that are developed around the world are developed using internationally recognized carbon standards. So there are entities out there, most of them are nonprofit entities, that put out the rules for how to develop a project. And within each of those entities, so Climate Action Reserve, American Carbon Registry, each of those entities has a set of methodologies underneath it that are really the specific instructions for how to develop a forestry project, a landfill gas project, a cook stove project in sub-Saharan Africa, whatever it is, whatever project type, they have the rules, the methodology for how to develop it, how an auditor comes in and what they have to look at, and then how the carbon offsets are issued. And it's an important point to note, the second bullet here, that just all of the projects we develop and all high quality projects must have a third party auditor come in and certify the project. And that happens every time before we get issuance of credit. So it doesn't just happen at the beginning of a 40-year forestry project. It happens the first year of a 40-year forestry project, and the next and the next, and so on, because integrity and conservatism are ultra important in this market, because just given the nature of the market and that many people aren't familiar with it, the maintaining integrity is ultra critical, right? Because it's, even though the market's been around, even though we've been developing projects for 20 years, this is our 20th anniversary this year as BlueSource, it's still a pretty small market when you look at other markets worldwide. And then similar to RECs, these offsets are issued, traded, and retired on public registries. And so there's that level of transparency, and the project documentation, how the project was developed, what the auditors saw when they came in, all of that's publicly available so that people can go in and look at the details. And again, it's to maintain that level, the high quality of the projects and the transparency of the projects.
And on the auditing side, so do auditors actually go to the project sites? They go out to the forest, things like that?
Yes, yeah. So there are different rules for different project types, but especially for the very first issuance of credits and the very first audit, there's a site visit. So that's for almost every project type. And then depending on the project type, usually they're required to do an audit every year, but not a site visit every year, just depending on, because some of the projects we develop in Alaska, forestry projects, in the UP, it's not really financially feasible. It would really hinder the financial feasibility of the project to have an auditor go out every year. And we have the technology and the capability with satellite monitoring and such to be able to prove, hey, the forest is still there. It didn't get cut down from last year to this year. And then so there's a field visit required once every 2, 3, 5 years, usually at the most.
How does the third party get accreditation? Is it national, international, state?
It's a good question. Each are accredited by the carbon standard that they're verifying that the project is developed under. So Climate Action Reserve, American Carbon Registry, VCS, Gold Standard, they all have a list of accredited verifiers. And most of those verifiers are relatively large organizations that are also ISO certified to do ISO audits and things like that. So, but each one is accredited by the carbon standard. And most have multiple, most of these organizations are relatively large, and so they can verify credits under usually multiple standards.
Good, thanks.
So this is just a quick diagram to show the entities in the market, right? And so the offsets get issued to BlueSource if we've developed the project, and then we sell those to a number of different entities. We sell them to retailers, and so when I say retailers, these are sort of full service environmental instrument companies that come in, and they don't develop the projects themselves, but they work with the buyers to understand what they want, and then they go out and they source the instruments from developers. They usually provide a bit more in terms of sometimes they provide a little bit on the consulting side, but they also provide a lot on the communication side. So they're doing more than just a broker or a trader would do, sort of buying and selling and connecting to counterparties and just, churning deals through. They're really doing a lot more engagement with the buyer. So we sell our credits to retailers. We also sell them to brokers and traders who are really more in it for, Boyd, you mentioned earlier, sort of the secondary market, right? The buying and the selling and the trading of these. It doesn't, in the voluntary market, historically, the market has been very oversupplied. And so taking positions and buying carbon offsets in hopes of reselling them for a profit in the future has been a very risky proposition, just because there's been so much volume in terms of supply and not enough demand. We're finally starting to see that change in the last couple of years. I mean, our business is growing quite a bit. There are new, you can see every day there's a new announcement of a company who's claiming carbon neutrality or wants to go carbon neutral or buy all green energy. And so, and then combined with some of the larger macro effects going on in the market, like the Paris Agreement, the US rejoining the Paris Agreement. And so countries at a country level starting to account for this and be held accountable for their emissions. You may have heard of the CORSIA program. International air travel is now going to be, any growth in international air travel in terms of emissions is going to be fully offset by all of the different countries in the world. They basically agreed to say, okay, after 2019, any growth in this industry is we have to offset it. So that, I mean, the CORSIA program, the CORSIA regulations that the International Civil Aviation Organization has put on themselves is going to end up sucking up billions of carbon offsets over the next 10 to 15 years. So this just goes to show you that the credits can come to you from a few different ways, but ultimately, as Mike mentioned, just like RECs, they have to be retired before you can claim usage of them. So for our clients, most of them have BlueSource retire the credits on their behalf and provide them proof of retirement, because most companies don't want to manage these registry accounts where they can hold credits. Some do, but not all, not most of them. I just have a couple of slides here on pricing, and we'll stick with the pricing discussion, but I want to just skip through these next two pretty quickly. This is just to give you an idea of the range in prices, right? So $10 to $20 a ton for grassland projects, all the way down to $3 to $5 a ton for landfill gas or HFC reclaim projects. And the important thing to note is what really drives pricing, in addition to the cost to develop the project, what really drives it are the co-benefits of the project. So the more charisma, the more positive impacts a project has outside of just the emission reduction, typically the higher the price. And so you can think about a landfill gas project. There's a landfill that's just venting methane. They cover it, they capture the gas, they destroy the gas one way or another, a flare or in an engine to create power. It's a great project. It's got good emission reduction benefits, but it doesn't really have a lot of community impact, positive community impact, or wildlife or biodiversity preservation impact. Whereas if you look at a forestry project, when a forester or a forest landowner decides to conserve their forest, they can be having positive impacts on local waterways and watersheds. They can be preserving habitat for endangered species. So there are just other co-benefits that go along with that commitment and that reduction in carbon. And so, the price is typically a bit higher for those types of projects. And the same goes internationally. So internationally, renewable energy projects can sometimes generate carbon offsets or a renewable energy instrument. But you can imagine, the scale, the commercial scale of renewable energy projects in China and India, and the lack of a lot of co-benefits with those projects mean a relatively low credit price or offset price, where similar to the US, forestry is typically the most expensive and has the most impact in terms of co-benefits internationally. So we don't have to spend a lot of time on this. The way we use the Sustainable Development Goal framework to articulate the co-benefits of the project. So that's just sort of become market standard over the last 3 to 5 years in the carbon market to link your project's co-benefits to some of these sustainable development goals. So as you can imagine, international projects frequently will hit lots of sustainable development goal or have lots of sustainable development goal impacts. Whereas in the US, there absolutely still are SDG impacts. But for example, it's harder to develop a project in the US that has poverty alleviation, just given the circumstances of the US and where the projects are developed, versus say a project in sub-Saharan Africa that might have poverty alleviation benefits. So this is really what I wanted to end with. And it was in hopes to put the discussion in a little more context. So as the city looks to, and as the plan looks to reduce Holland residents' emissions from roughly 19 tons per person down to 10, that could be achieved, whether it's through a consortium of buyers, public sector and private sector, whether it's residents and the city. This is really just meant to show the big picture. I'm not really advocating for who should be buying the offsets, but so to go from 19 tons per person down to 10 tons per person just through offsetting, assuming 35,000 residents at $1 a ton, that costs $315,000, up to, I assume, $9 a ton, which at the scale you're buying the credits, that's probably what a forestry offset would cost, $8 to $9 a ton. That'd be $2.84 million. So that really is just meant to help you put some boundaries on what it would cost to be able to say, okay, the city's reduced emissions this far, and now we're going to offset the rest so that everybody's emissions are now 10 tons per person, right? And so then the same, below is just the same math. If you went all the way to carbon neutrality, right? 665 grand a year, or roughly $6 million a year. Again, depending on the price per ton of the offsets. And what most big buyers do, and the city would be a pretty large buyer, or the community as a whole would be a pretty large buyer. Most develop a portfolio, right? They support some local projects if they're available. Then they support some national or international projects to help bring the price down and have other co-benefit impacts that aren't achievable in maybe locally, right? So Blue Source, we've developed, we have 4 forestry projects in development in Michigan, voluntary projects. We have some compliance projects as well, but we have 4 forestry projects in Michigan. As you can imagine, those don't have poverty alleviation benefits, but if that's a priority of the city or a priority of the residents, then you have to look outside of Michigan to find credits that also have those co-benefits. So just something to note.
Hey, Ben.
Yeah.
Ben, this is all pure carbon offsets. This price range does not factor like buying RECs for the electricity.
Exactly.
Correct?
Yeah, good point. So this just assumes what I was saying earlier when we were looking at the different scopes of emissions. This assumed you converted everything to metric tons of CO2e and bought offsets for all of it. If the city and the residents bought RECs for just scope 2, the price would likely be a lot lower, because RECs in terms of an instrument are much cheaper on a per ton basis. If you convert it to offsets to tons, they're cheaper. So these I would consider these high-end estimates, and it would be likely quite a bit cheaper, if RECs were used for scope 2.
And the reason why it would be less expensive if RECs were used is because in that 19 tons per person, a big piece of that is the electricity consumed by the city.
Well, consumed by
the city collectively, not the individual municipality, but the people that live within the boundaries of the city.
Yeah, well, let's use the word community there.
Community, my apologies.
Yeah. No, that makes sense.
And these are just some examples of the projects we've developed. We developed project sheets like this, one page sort of PDFs that show the co-benefits. You can see the SDG impacts that we list. And these are just a few that we've developed in the US. But they're intentionally sort of small, just to say, these are some real life examples of projects that generate credits.
Hey, Ben, this is Dave. If I can maybe ask a quick question here, just to make sure again, like RECs, with RECs, there's a lifespan associated with that. When you develop a project and you develop the amount of offsets that are available, those offsets are going to essentially change what naturally would happen. That those projects are going to change what naturally would happen, and there's a life of that project. Are you buying the entire life of that project? Is there rateability to that over, how you receive those credits by year? Do you get them all because at one time you get to get them all, and then the other piece of it is when you think about if it's not all at one time, then just like there is with RECs, as there's more demand for this, you'll start to see an increasing price. So the illustrative dollar value you had on your example before, the slide before, was really kind of based upon today's price as you see those prices. So maybe I want to just chat about a couple of those things.
Yeah, it's a good point. So yeah, exactly. So the prices I showed were prices today, right? Like if a company or a city came to market today to buy credits, those were just general pricing as of today. You're definitely right that that we've seen pricing increase, and in the well, so let me take a step back. Most buyers today still come to the market annually, and that's true. That's historically how buyers have worked, right? Because there's an oversupply of credits. The buyers have the power because the market's oversupplied, so they just come into the market every year and then say, all right, what are my choices this year, Blue Source? Show me some forestry projects or landfill gas. Let's match this budget. We want to hit these SDGs, and they go about it that way, and they sort of build annual portfolios, and so that gives them ultimate flexibility, but it subjects them to market price risk, right? Because they have no long-term strategy or contracted offtake of the credits. So it's a give and take, but that's how historically it's been done. More and more often, and the larger the entity, we're seeing multi-year contracts. We call them offtake contracts, right? For these carbon offsets. And so you can do it on a project by project basis. You could do it on just a total volume and price basis and say, we just want an average of, we need 100,000 tons per year, 100,000 credits per year, and we want to spend $5 a ton. And Blue Source make us a portfolio, right? So you can do it a little more generically that way. And then typically what happens is almost every time, unless you're funding a project, which doesn't happen that often, the buyer just pays upon delivery of the credits. So you sign a multi-year offtake agreement. So a couple of years, 3 years, 5 years. I'm working on one now that's 7 years. And it's at a fixed price. The price is generally escalating because we're seeing prices go up in the market. And so we typically get some escalator on the annual fixed price. But you could come to us today and say, we want a 5-year fixed offtake from, this forestry project. And we would say, okay, it's going to be $9 this year, $10 the next year, $11 a ton the next year, however long. And then you would only pay, the city or the company would pay upon delivery of the credits every year. So there's no forward payment. It's just, you're paying for the product as it shows up, basically. And and most of the contracts we enter into are what we call unit contingent. And this is getting a little bit in the weeds, but that means that the buyer only pays for what shows up. And so if something goes wrong with the project, for example, and half the credits are delivered that were supposed to be delivered, the buyer only pays for half. Now you still have to go find and likely make up the other half, which has its own risk. But from a contract perspective, you only pay for what shows up.
Ben, I'm just going to jump in real quick. This is a short, easy question, I think, for someone catching up, right? So the previous slide where you had different prices of the cost to the community, and I'm using that word on purpose, the cost to the community, the prices that you put there are annual cost. It's not a one-time cost, it's an annual cost.
Exactly right. That's an annual cost because, yeah, exactly. Because if you buy all the credits you need to achieve carbon neutrality this year, and then you don't buy them next year, and you haven't reduced all of your emissions, then you're back to a normal emissions scenario. And so yes, that's an annual cost, exactly. And so the thought is that as you put a price on the carbon that you're emitting through, as you buy offsets, you're putting a price on carbon. It can make those offset or those actual emission reduction projects internally look more attractive because you're paying for those emissions if they occur through having to offset them. And so you sort of set the offsetting up against all of your different reduction opportunities over time.
Yeah, and I wanted to hit on that too, so when you see these big articles from organizations that have, they're claiming carbon neutral, net zero, they are not actually zero emissions. They're using these instruments, RECs and offsets, to achieve that neutrality. And then as they, switch out fluorescent lights for LED, their energy intensity goes down, and therefore they don't need to buy as many of these instruments the following year. And so what Ben's talking about there is factoring the mitigation, the avoidance of that extra purchase into the financial return estimates of your LED lighting retrofit project. And so as a community, that would be, if we wanted to, so this is, so if we wanted, we could be, net zero next year. It's just going to cost whatever that number is, hundreds of thousands of dollars to achieve that. And then as we move forward and we're doing more of the work on the opportunity matrix, that price would go down because we don't need to buy as many. Am I thinking about that right?
Yeah, exactly right. Now the price may not go down in terms of per offset, but the cost to the community would go down if you're reducing your actual emissions, because then you have fewer offsets to buy every year.
Right. Other questions for
The only thing I would add to that, though, is that, the things that are involved with reducing the actual emissions may be investments of themselves that may have a certain cost per ton. So if we're looking at, there's always this economic decision, as Brian's talking about, in the same way you did on the whole additionality, chart there, is that, there's a increased risk and cost as you go to actually implement your own solution as opposed to buying from a attribute. And so, there's going to be investments to lower your costs or your carbon emissions, and those have a cost to them too. And when we did the opportunity matrix, we started looking at the current investments we're making and how much tons they're reducing on an annual basis. You can kind of line that up. You can see we saw $1 to $9. We see everywhere from $7 up to as much as, I think it was $80, $90 or actually in the hundreds of dollars for certain programs. And so we're kind of weighing those two things. But as was pointed out, sometimes there are other benefits that come from various projects too that aren't just related to the carbon reduction.
Right. That's a good point, Dave. While other people are thinking of their next question, Ben, I have a question for you. Mike, you might know this as well. When people say, when organizations say we're making a commitment to be net zero by 2030, are they basically not buying offsets and RECs right now, and they're just committing to buy them in 2030? Or are they, what do they say? Like, what are they saying when they say that? What does that mean?
The devil is definitely in the details there, right? I mean, it's all about what their public commitment is. And so, you have a lot of big companies that have joined, some of these big initiatives and report on their emissions annual. And they, like Science-Based Target Initiative is one of them, right? So companies make commitments to align their company's emissions with the goals under the Paris Agreement. And they have a 2030, 2040 net zero goal. They may not be doing any offsetting or REC buying until the very end, right? When they get to a point where, so say it's 2040, they've reduced all of the emissions they can possibly reduce internally. And then at that point, there's likely some residual emissions that they'll have to offset either with RECs or offsets, right? And they might not be doing any instrument buying until that point. Contrasted with other companies like, like a Microsoft or some of these other more progressive companies that they have a plan, a glide path to get to that net zero point in 20 or 30 years. And in the meantime, they're going to be offsetting all of their emissions each year until they get there. And so we see both, right? And I think there's been some research over the last 12 months or so that companies that have a net zero commitment are much more likely, it's kind of obvious, but much more likely to be buying instruments and offsetting today than a company who doesn't have a commitment. But you really have to look at what the company's public commitment is.
Ben's exactly right. I mean, the easy way to think of it is like, I am going to lose 50 pounds of weight in 2030. But you can still eat a lot of cheeseburgers today. You could eat as many cheeseburgers as you want. You could just try to lose 100 pounds in 2029 to get there in 2030. Or you could say, I'm going to lose 50 pounds by 2030, and I'm going to lose, whatever, 40 pounds by 2028, and subsequently downhill. So some organizations just go the flashy route, and they're like still eating cheeseburgers, and they're like, we'll figure it out. And others are saying, no, we're going to be disciplined. We still made our goal out in the future, but we're going to have incremental checkpoints as we get there. So the splashy goal doesn't mean anything. What you got to dig into the details to understand if they're working on the weight loss in the meantime, or if they're just hoping they can like stop eating cheeseburgers in 2029 and call it good.
Yeah. If only there were an offset for cheeseburgers.
For weight loss. Yeah. If only you could buy offsets to lose weight. Yeah, I agree, Ben.
That's like a whole YouTube channel there, Mike. That whole metaphor. That's good.
Just trying to make it approachable.
Yeah, we all like cheeseburgers, I think. So that makes sense.
Sure do.
PJ, Jeff, Tim, Nikki, Boyd, questions for these two guys?
I guess one question I have regarding offsets, is there, and maybe I just missed it, like the difference between the like bundled and unbundled RECs, is there a similar kind of distinction in the offset world?
There really isn't, because there is not an underlying sort of commodity. Like the underlying commodity of the REC is the energy itself, right? And so they're either attached together or not. There are some cases where for some project types you can have them bundled. So think about if a large forest products company, right? They could technically or theoretically generate they could do a forest carbon project on the land that they own. And instead of selling those offsets to someone else, they could say, we're going to hold on to them and we're going to bundle that offset with the wood product that we're selling to sell a carbon neutral wood product, right? You could do that. They could do that, but it's really not common. And if they do that, then they obviously can't sell the offset, because if they're claiming they have a carbon neutral product, then they have to just generate those credits and retire them themselves to sell on in their product. So it's very uncommon in the offset world.
I guess one more related question. So is there a differentiation between something like, say, a forestry product, which is soaking up carbon and getting an offset that way, or a project where you're doing something like an energy efficiency project where you're avoiding carbon that like would have been emitted in the business as usual case, right? You see is there a distinction in those types of projects?
There definitely is, and it really is buyer preference in terms of what the types of projects and the types of offsets they want to buy. There's a pretty big debate going on right now in the voluntary market as to like, should companies be only buying offsets that are generated from like a forestry project where it's sucking carbon out of the atmosphere versus a project like an avoided emissions project, an energy efficiency project. And the general guidance from some of the SBTI that I mentioned, Science Based Target Initiative is one of them, but the general guidance is that when you get to that net zero point 20, 30 years down the road, that's when you need to only be buying the removals credits, those sequestration credits, because you need to be really taking your emissions to net zero by eliminating, by sucking up an equal amount of carbon through buying offsets from a removals project versus an avoided emissions project. Right now, on your way to that net zero point, the general guidance is anything works. We need all of the above solutions because we need companies taking action. And so if you want to support energy efficiency or landfill gas that's avoiding emissions, great. If you want to support reforestation or improved forest management where there are removals taking place, great. Like really, they need to be doing everything possible.
Thanks, Jeff. Nikki?
Yes, so you are a company that is like a Northern Trust or an AG Edwards in the financial world, and you will do this for a company and you take a percentage of it, or may I as a company start looking into and buying these credits or these offsets or RECs on my own?
Yeah, so we do, I guess I think if I understand you right, so if we develop a project for a company, so or say a landowner, it's easy, maybe easier analogy. There's a company that owns a forest, right? And they decide not to cut it down, and so they're going to generate carbon offsets. We do all of the technical development work. We have engineers and professional foresters on staff. We do all the technical development work. We hire the third-party auditor. We get all of that. We take the project from phase 0 to issuance of carbon credits each year. And then we have a revenue share agreement with the landowner. And so we get paid only through the successful generation, issuance, and monetization of those credits to, when they're sold. So that's typically how we structure it with the project owners. In the case where a company wanted to buy credits from a forestry project in Indonesia, we would just work with the project developers that we know there to buy their credits at a small margin and sell them to the buyer, but so that we can create that portfolio. So yeah, we work in both
different ways. Yeah. Thank you.
PJ and Tim, you're both off mute, so I
I'm off mute.
You're both excited.
It's I want to thank them both for bringing us all up to speed in participating with the BPW over the years. Dave has given me a reasonable education as we've moved forward as an organization, so I'm familiar with some. And this today helped improve my overall understanding. So a great educational session.
Yeah, it was really interesting.
There are some more resources on our website too, potentially just like the Foresight team as well. If you go to our website, you can see some case studies. Mike mentioned BlackRock. BlackRock purchased all of their international renewable energy from us last year through IREX, through international renewable energy credits. So you can see those types of examples, and on the carbon offset project side too, which helps make it a little more real.
PJ?
Yeah, I think, Brian, this was a terrific presentation. I think you touched on there's just a whole lot of potential strategic tactics that, these tools can provide us. I think that our group or some group in our community is going to probably have to sit down and wrestle a little bit with the philosophy of whether our goals are truly to offset our emissions or directly reduce our emissions. And, I would imagine it's a combination of both, and timing needs to play into it. But this certainly are tools to, help our community go towards these more aggressive goals that we're hearing, yet hopefully protect ourselves from some of the, harsher economic impacts that achieving some of those goals might put forth.
Yeah. Yeah. And I kind of like, to me, these instruments are fascinating and intriguing, especially from the standpoint of like climate, the climate crisis it's a global crisis, right? So to participate in projects, by way of financial instruments in other parts of the globe is very aligned with the problem, right? Like, so it's that makes it really intriguing, right? You're not like spending money for something happening somewhere else and the problem isn't somewhere else. The problem's everywhere. So we got things to do at home, and there's things to do other places. So this is a neat way to think about it.
And I think our strategies will be long-term and short-term, as will our risks be long-term and short-term, or bigger risks and smaller risks. There's a balance in this whole scheme.
Yeah. Anyone else want to jump in here with questions for these guys before we kick them out?
Just want to thank them again. It was very informative. So that was good.
Good.
That was great.
Organized.
This will be one we'll mandate the whole city council watches. That's it. This session, they have to watch this one. Yeah, and I think anecdotally, I think everyone needs to know, because Mike and I do this every day for a living, there is serious momentum with businesses around leveraging these instruments and doing the whole, reduction as well. But like, it is a very real thing that even 18 months ago was not tangible like this, both locally, very, very, very locally, and throughout the whole country. There's a lot of companies that are trying to figure this out. So
Good.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah.
Take care.
Thanks, Mike. Thanks, Ben.
Thank you both.
Guys.
Yeah.
Appreciate it.
Yeah.
All right. That was smart to do that at the beginning, because everything else on the agenda, except for what Joe's going to share, is stuff that we cover every week, every 2 weeks. So
Before
Yeah,
we
boy.
wait for them to jump off, my gears were turning during that, and it really wasn't appropriate to talk about it while they were necessarily on it. It's just a question to Dave. Is I look at the energy resources plan, and it has Campbell in there, for example, at about 100,000 tons of emission levels. It looks like per annum. At least that's the dive that the graph shows once Campbell comes offline in 2030, correct? Ballpark.
Yes.
Okay. I think in our last discussion, when I look at these offsets or, these RECs, to match up in an ideal world, the ability to, retire something like a Campbell and then have the cash outflow preserved, paying for RECs or offsets, would make a huge impact. I mean, the math shows Campbell's worth, I think around, if I did my math right, around 2.8 tons per capita. If I did my math right, I may not have. And so that, I think you said though, in the last meeting, that the concept of getting out of those.
Well, one of the things to keep in mind though, I'm sorry, Boyd, if I can interrupt you real quick. You got to remember that our service territory is almost twice the city of Holland's usage. So Campbell has the city of Holland. So when we look at that per capita, we're looking at just the portion of electricity that's serving in the city of Holland. So, it might be like 1.4 as opposed to 2.8. I don't know. Again, and I'd have to check your numbers on that. But just so you know that when you look at the integrated resource plan, that's for our entire service territory, and the community energy plan is for the city of Holland.
All right. Yeah. Thank you for that. Is it from our last discussion? I guess the bigger point is, you can, on one hand, you could say, okay, well, if it's not possible to basically retire our participation with Bell or Campbell, it is possible to purchase offsets to those contracts. And that comes at a cost, right, for a number of years until they do retire. But at least there's a clear end in sight. You can enter into a longer term arrangement and realize efficiencies, it sounds like, from what they're saying. The longer the term, the more potential price benefit or fixed rates you get with some small escalators or something. On the other hand, the concept of being able to exit contracts, use that, if there is enough power sources elsewhere, right, not replacing, the ability to not have to replace, which this shows we might have that capacity. Could the cash flow, then go to purchasing offsets, and now you get a double benefit?
Yeah. So I think you're bringing up, some interesting concepts here, Boyd. I think one of the things that probably this group would have to wrestle with a little bit is that there are mechanisms in place right now for our customers to also make those purchases, right? So, is that a BPW function to do that? Or is that a means of providing that opportunity for our customers to take the personal, or from a corporate standpoint, a corporate responsibility? Because maybe there's a corporation out there already buying RECs or buying carbon offsets. And now the BPW goes out and greens the entire portfolio. In a way, there's a double dipping to the negative side on that. So I think, so we have to kind of be cognizant of what the utility's role is in that relative to or absent of any regulatory regime to force like the 15% mandate on the renewable portfolio standard, for example.
Yeah.
The other thing is the length of commitment that you do on that, relative to another regulatory regime coming in and affecting the utility. Just an example would be new administration coming in at the federal level, introduces a carbon tax. Would our carbon offsets qualify in that new regulatory regime to be valid against that carbon tax? I can't answer that. I sure would hope so. But if we made a big investment against that or commitment, and then we found out that they had no value, then I'm paying twice because I'm paying a carbon tax as a new utility in that regime, and then also paying for the carbon offsets. So again, I'm not trying to scare you on that, but I'm saying that these are factors that have to be thought of where we would make that commitment.
But all of that is back to, I think, something Dave, you brought up before, which is, there's the strategy recommendation from us, and then there's like the task force that will eventually be named to like figure out the mix of all of this stuff, right? And
correct.
And I think that we all need to, in order for us to make a recommendation on strategy, we got to have some level of comfort on the doability, which is what Boyd is unpacking, and which is what we're doing today. And this whole process, right, is we're building up enough foundational confidence in the raw underlying data to be able to say, yeah, there's something here. So let's get a more aggressive goal and do a task force to figure out what that looks like, leveraging these instruments. Like if that's the recommendation we have,
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
And we may know more by the time we do come up with recommendations or the steering committee begins their strategies, because these things take so long.
Well, this committee's not going to take that long.
We're looking at April, aren't we?
We're gonna have recommendations before whenever that day happens, Nikki.
Oh, yes.
Brian, is this the time you want me to submit our final plan now?
Yeah, I think it's good. It's good. Travis and I have been working day and night.
$20 million budget over the next 10 years, and it's solved.
We're funding it with frozen yogurt, though, so we're pretty confident it'll work.
And again, I'll just say one more time, right? There's also that voluntary mandatory, which is probably both a legal question, but it's a strategy question too. As far as, do we provide the strategy of the on-ramp for users to pay like an energy rate and maybe additionally like a carbon offset rate, right? Or do we have even the ability to just say, well, you don't have a choice. It's baked right in the rate that you're paying to the BPW or some other source, right? So those are all the things that still, there's a lot of detail there, but Brian and Boyd, you're unpacking it exactly correctly. You have to know a little bit about the doability of it as a strategy, and yet not go too far because there's a lot of details.
Right. I think there's what you're talking about. Yeah, there's a doable aspect in terms of being able to quantify and then create, a mechanism to offset it. The issue is, like Keith said, both strategically, whether we want to go there, and then two, I think is, the legality aspect of it being a forced situation by essentially baking that into a rate structure is probably a question that needs to be explored. But again, that could be part of the mechanism of the implementation side of things, as opposed to the strategy development.
Yeah. Yeah. And to the point around other corporations already doing this, like the short answer to that is yes. And so there's a fact-finding mission in front of some group of people tasked to map this all out around like who's already buying it. Cause there's no, there's already a group buy happening in town, whether we like it or not. And so like getting all those people in a room and so this is
maybe we'll find that we've been overstating our emissions as a community,
Thank you.
because there's a good amount of buying going on right now. Who knows? I mean, I don't think we know what the inventory looks like on that.
And as it relates to tracking the performance of the plan, we need to be, I mean, whether this becomes part of the strategy or not, if you're going to track the performance of the plan, you need to be tracking that one way or the other, right? Like if if LG Chem comes on and buys Rex for their whole facility, that matters to how we're even measuring this thing, whether we do something with it or not, right?
So Brian, I'd love to next session, I brought it up in the last session, that I'd love to go through the calculation that is in place now that even calculates our metric. Because we know there's some assumptions in there around transportation. You know, we think we have electric and gas pretty well, measurable. And then you can see now there's probably a missing variable in that calculation too. It starts to consider understanding and knowing who is purchasing Rex and offsets now in the community. So right there, we know there's a variable missing in the math. Even if it's zero, the variable should still be there, right? In this modern world. So I think we need to go through that equation and the assumptions that built it. And
I'm cool with that. I would not be the person. Is that Dave? Can you walk?
Yeah,
I mean,
so Andrew Reynolds, has made presentations on that in the past, and we can see if he could be available potentially for that. If not, we may have some others in our organization that are close enough to it. And I do think it kind of supports this concept of where we had the education and then we come back and try to reinforce it. Going through the calculation and then kind of talking about this subject relative to that could actually help reinforce the education of this particular topic. So if that's what the committee would like us to do, we will see about trying to have a little bit of information about the methodology on that calculation for the next meeting.
Good.
if that's possible, Dave, I think that would be great. And if we can't pull that off in 2 weeks, then my vote would be to spend a lot of time digging into commercial, institutional, and industrial buildings next time because that's a big percentage of the pie, and there wasn't tons. It'd be good to learn where we're all at with that.
I think we can get the I would imagine we can get the information on the calculation next time.
On that
I also
lever.
think what we can do is go back to, because I know we're going to run out of time today and we want to get to Joe here in a minute.
Yeah.
But to go to the opportunity matrix and look at what is in there right now as it relates to carbon offsets, just like we did with the electric portfolio.
Yeah.
Kind of starting to create that list of strategies that we think are going to make it through to a kind of a composite list that the group will still wrestle with and maybe add and subtract, but just start moving in a direction where we're starting to zero in on strategies there. I think would be a good thing to kind of reinforce, taking it lever by lever if we can. And then after that, Brian, if we can move in on March 1 to the building side of the building consumption side of things, we can figure out what exactly educational topics we want to present on that. Obviously, we've got our own energy waste reduction program. I think one of the concepts about access to capital under on-bill for residential and possibility of PACE on commercial are a couple of items there. So we'll have to kind of maybe talk with you and Travis about how to get the proper educational pieces together for those meetings.
Yeah, that's good. Okay, cool. Well, we want to be at the very least, Joe, it's almost 5 for you. So we got to get to your line item on the agenda, buddy.
And I need to drop off at 5. It's my anniversary today, so I will be in front.
Happy anniversary.
Oh, congratulations.
Yeah, just Keith and I can introduce Joe here. I mean, I just wanted to just say it's been wonderful to work with Joe over the last several weeks here. And he's been kind of going off doing his thing. Doing a wonderful job with it. So you've got the draft report here. We're not going to spend a lot of time on that because not a lot's changed, but just heading up the fact that the section that we were next going to start working on was sort of the community comparisons section. Mm-hmm. And that's really where Joe is doing a lot of his work to try to figure out how does Holland compare to other communities so that we can start looking at what those communities are doing, what those communities are achieving, how they're setting their goals, and such as that. So Becky, I think if you could just allow Joe to share his screen, I think he'll have the ability to bring up what he's working on.
And Dave set that up perfect. Joe has done a phenomenal job, and that's the great thing about taping these. So Boyd, happy anniversary. Enjoy your evening. But you can come back, and you're really going to want to watch this later, because I think this is really, Joe's got a great start on some of the things in particular that you talked about you really wanted to see. So take it away, Joe, and welcome. Thank you.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
All right. Thank you, Keith and Dave, for the introduction. As I mentioned, my name is Joe Sigma, Nature Rich Community Manager with the ODC Network, working under Travis. Been hanging out with you guys the past couple months, every other Monday, listening in the background, so it's nice to get some airtime, and I appreciate the opportunity to be working on this. I'll try to keep it tight and just give you a quick update. Today's update really is just a methodology check and looking at process here. As you've all experienced, looking at all these variables can feel like boiling the ocean. So doing that for multiple communities is taking some time, but I think we're off to a good start and just giving you a chance to speak into that and check in on what's going on there. So just getting into it quickly, the objective, of course, for benchmarking, my goal here is to facilitate informed conversations using data, and to do this in a digestible way with all these different metrics and concepts and ideas that we're tracking. So on screen, what you're seeing is kind of a bunch of data for different communities aggregated together. We've got preliminary information and preliminary statistics and metrics that are in here, but again, with this ongoing work, these are all developing and changing over time. So there's not anything that's worth drawing a conclusion from yet, but we're getting there. So to explain kind of what you're looking at here, we've got on the top all these different metrics, and my apologies for the angle if anyone's kind of careening to look at these, but lining up with the triple bottom line, which I know this team is all aware of and understands: people, profit, and planet for key indicators. So looking at our community compared to other communities in these places of people and profit, and seeing who lines up with us for us to look at in terms of the planet and those energy goals. And then on the vertical axis here, we have cities in Michigan, scrolling down, cities across the United States, and also some international examples that I'm looking into as well. Again, this is just a starting point, continuing to add new cities as we find more data. And then the middle, kind of this fun area with all these dots and different colors. This is just a quick visual indicator with data behind it. So there's raw data feeding these, and a green, yellow, and red is really a rating for how close the city is to us on the indicator in this vertical column. So someone with a green dot in a given column means they're close, a yellow dot means kind of close, and a red dot means they're not really comparable for that given metric. And worth noting on that subject, so this is not calculated arbitrarily, but there's a formula working in the background with given margins that we can adjust at a later time to kind of choose what's really supposed to be close or not, given the topic we're looking at there. So that's kind of the methodology and the process of how this is set up. I can pause if there's any questions on how this is laid out before I get into the nitty-gritty of the data that we're looking at here in the cities that have been selected. All right, I'll take no questions as a good sign. So moving forward, just people, profit, and planet. So hopefully you can read through these. I've got it blown up as big as possible. But these indicators and key metrics that I've selected are, for a start, readily available for all communities on this list. So working with things like census data, annual financial reports, and the like, to find kind of the low-hanging fruit, so population, age, geography, education. Things like housing, income, and industry, those are common standards and metrics you can find for any city. And then the work that's taking place right now and the outreach that I'm doing, don't tell Travis, but I'm not an expert in all of these areas. So connecting with folks from the city and the DPW and the community, as well as some networks we have access to across the country as both a city and the ODC. So the Urban Sustainability Directors Network, ICLEI, and kind of those groups that are working in this space to find what the key important metrics are and where to get that data. Some of those more critical data points, but they're difficult to find and take a little bit more digging to come up with. So that's the vertical axis, and just to see those and explain kind of how these dots work. So if you take a given indicator like age and want to know more about it, if you're having discussion about the age and growth population in the city. You can blow out or drill down into that topic and find the given data for that subject. And that's what's feeding these scores of yellow, green, or red. So you get just kind of a quick snapshot of what's going on there. And behind each one of these columns is these drilled down portions of different indicators that I'm tracking. So condensed, you see 10 or 15 columns, but behind it, there's tens of hundreds of columns feeding these scores.
Cool.
And then in the city section, just a quick intro to that. So for cities, of course, Michigan is kind of self-explanatory. There's some of the bigger cities that we know about that also have some level of sustainability prowess. Across the country, that blows out quite a bit. So we have our first four here are the economic indicators used by Lakeshore Advantage. There's some small to mid-sized cities in here that have stuck out for sustainability performance and have some common ground with us. And then towards the bottom, keying in on cities that have a similar setup as the BPW with Holland and that the municipality owns the utility provider. And again, as I mentioned, reaching out to community members, experts, and even this group to try to figure out which cities we should be looking at and continuing to develop this list. The international portion is again kind of a third tier priority. There's definitely going to be some usable data there, but that's not where I've started. But hoping to find those metrics too as I go along. And then of course you can see too, worth noting, we have the kind of the easy indicators, these color dots for the people and profit section, with those being qualifiers for the planet portion. I mean, that's because we're looking at kind of that, are they close to us or not? But when we look at planet, it's more about a performance of good or bad. So that will not be in this final version, something that's green, yellow, or red, but more about the metrics and the kind of the yes or no's. So are they doing offsets, or are they doing anything with carbon reporting or setting carbon goals? It's not really are they close to us or not, it's where are they at in their journey. So that's kind of where the narrative will take place. I think the only other thing I'll note before turning it over for questions or further comments from Keith and Dave and the group, we initially were hoping to find a couple of cities that lined up pretty close and had kind of these green, you're in the same range as those dots across the board. But we're continuing to find that, like people, no two cities are alike. And so there's not a Holland 2.0 out there. We can definitely find cities that are closer to us and that can give some insights there. But as you add variables to the equation, you continue to get more and more results. And so it kind of makes the story more complex. So the value of this specific tool will be to pick out kind of those key metrics that you're talking about for a given topic and be able to say, okay, let's look at the Nashville or the Indianapolis and say, can we compare to them because of this reason, whether that's the tax base or the city revenue or the age or demographics, going forward for your team's conversations. And then coming out of this, I hope to kind of drill down into a few of those key cities that we find the most commonalities with and kind of provide a narrative in that final report for you all to go through.
Hey, Joe, do you want to blow out the industry one a minute, maybe?
Sure, yeah, I can provide some more insight on that. So for industry and tax base, and my apologies, there's a lot of data here to go through. We were trying to find kind of a proxy for, and correct me, Dave, if I'm wrong here, energy intensity and also just the economic balance of a city.
Correct.
So the two places we looked, one is there's the census data, which is easy to find for all cities. And I have on the right side the raw sales dollars in these kind of buckets that they line it up in, and then also the per capita data calculated on the left. So we looked at that from census data, but also we're trying to drill into tax base as well. Tax base gets a little bit tricky when you look at cities outside of Michigan, and so I'm connecting with Jim Bush from the city to get kind of more strategic focus on how we can do that. But looking at just different ways to proxy economic conditions and energy intensity.
Joe, could you scroll up so we can see the Holland?
Yeah, my apologies.
No, you're good. So the 4 communities that Lakeshore Advantage benchmarks us against have between 3 and 20 times as many businesses. Greenville, Nashville, Indianapolis, and Cleveland.
So again, looking at it on a per capita basis, though, I think is the normalization there, as much as possible.
Got it.
And for this specific So I'll note this, and this is kind of the simplified version, but not every indicator in here contributes to that green, yellow, red rating. So obviously it's not helpful to have the raw data feed that in this. So it's the per capita that's feeding the final rating that you see in the quick view. But I do have both noted because obviously those are going to be much larger cities with bigger scale to work with.
Got it.
And the other thing to keep in mind that Lakeshore Advantage serves an area of the entirety of Allegan and Ottawa County. So again, not to say that should change things a whole lot, but they recognize that from a population standpoint, they're trying to punch above their weight class in Lakeshore Advantage and kind of looking at the best practices of that next tier. And so, you know, in looking at those things for how we just want to make sure that we also looked at it from an energy story as well in those communities, so we understood how they were performing from on their energy goals.
Yeah. How is that the towns with municipal utilities? Is that list, Dave, like particularly meaningful to you? Because within municipal utilities in the country, like, you know, like you're like, oh yeah, Glendale, Burbank, Owensboro. Like I know we go to conferences with those guys. Like those are folks that you're rubbing shoulders with and you feel like you're living the same sort of life or what?
Well, I think Joe continues to try to find other comparable communities that would be on there, but some of those are people that we, you know, do talk to at conferences and things like that. But I will tell you, Joe, this list primarily was selected, you know, based upon Joe's research of those that are have municipally owned utilities. I think the other thing that can be informative in terms of the goals is, you know, how they are connecting with or utilizing those utilities. So I think it's an important data factor in looking at Holland's situation, but there are others out there as well that I think could be, you know, put on this list. So one that was talked about today is actually much larger. They're one of the largest municipal owned, but Austin, Texas, obviously, is another public power community.
This is really tangential, but because you brought up Austin, Dave, have you met Mark Washington yet? He's the city manager in GR. He was the assistant city manager or something like that in Austin before he came to GR. So he could be an interesting person to get lunch with about this. I don't know, maybe not, but he might know something about that as well.
I know Mark.
Yeah, Keith, I wasn't asking you though. I was asking Dave. No,
there you go. Wow.
That's for you, Travis. That's for you, Travis.
Hey, what's your address, Brian? I'm sending someone over to your house tonight.
Well, I think the idea here too was to be able to say, look, you know, there's a lot of people out there that are talking about various programs, various goals and things like that. What this will allow us to do in addition is being able to see of those, you know, how many of them, you know, closely align with the, you know, people and industry profit sort of factors of our community.
Yeah.
You know, and I think that will allow some of this evaluation of our opportunity matrix against what they're working on too, to say, look, you know, here's everything we define. Are we missing something? Well, let's look at the comparable communities that are out there. You know, what are they talking about in terms of electric portfolio or building consumption or transportation or offsets or education, those 5 levers? You know, have they made any long-term goals themselves? If so, what are they? And by the time we get this boiled down, you'll be able to see, okay, yeah, here's all the communities or a good number of communities, but also here are the ones that closely align with Holland from the first 2 people and profit standpoints. So you can have some good foundational things to say, yeah, we're pursuing things that are aligned or quite different, you know, from some of these other similarly situated communities.
Yeah. Do people have comments or questions? Joe, I think this is awesome.
Great start.
This has tremendous
information.
potential.
Yeah.
I don't know that we follow it. It's just it's nice to see a comparison.
And again, I think Joe introduced this perfectly, right? Where this is more that process check at this point where there is a lot of work that he's already done, but more work to be done. and we'd all be completely overwhelmed by the amount of data. So I think the process of how he's putting this in and has, those abilities to take, 40 columns of information and figure out how to boil that down to, is it a green, a yellow, or a red dot? But then if you want to see the data behind it, you can pull that out. I just think Joe's gotten off to a great start here. But again, hopefully you all at least think that too, right? Because I think this is a really important component of your study and of the report that you'll recommend to council and the community.
And if any of you have heard, different things about other communities that aren't represented on this list, that, you think, what about this community? What are they doing? Or I've heard something about them, let's make sure that we take a look to see how well they align with Holland. And then also think about and look at, how they're addressing their energy goals in their community. So, we remain open to that. I think we started a pretty good list here, but there may be others that we might want to put on this list too. And I think the other thing is that Joe's work here is a really good tool for the future. So we're doing this STT process this time, and we'll be revisiting it, but not having to recreate the wheel again next time, but rather just kind of update the information. I think it'll be a really good tool for the next STT to work with as well.
Is there a defined, Joe, do you have a target when you want to beat a certain checkpoints in this thing? That I'm not putting you on the spot. If there isn't one, that's fine. But if, like, when do you think you're going to get to the planet part? What's your work plan right now, bud?
Yeah, so Keith and Dave and I set the initial goal of being ready for a process check today. And the goal was to have this people and profit part well populated, but planet kind of is the next place to kick off into. I have a lot of data kind of in the hopper ready to be populated, but it's just a matter of plugging and chugging through this. And then there's some meetings to happen in the next week or two to kind of get the initial data collection. And then it's a matter of boiling things down and continuing to work. So I really need to check with Keith and Dave on what their expectation is too, but we've not set a hard deadline on anything yet.
Yeah, so we've got we've just started our second lever of education, right? So next week we'll be wrapping that up. We've got 3 more levers when you think about building, consumption, the education piece and the transportation piece.
Right.
And we've been doing this 2-week process or 2-meeting process with each of those. It would be nice as we're starting to round out this list of potential strategies for this next time, that within the process of going through the levers, the data becomes available to us. So I think we're talking about, the next month to no more than 6 weeks, hopefully. And I think, Joe's, like you said, he's gone a long way towards that. So if the STT is comfortable with that, I think that's kind of where we're heading, is to try to make sure that we get you this information to check against the opportunity matrix that we've been working with, to make sure that the strategies, as we start going through these educational aspects on the different levers, really starts to take shape, that you have this tool eventually to be able to check against those other benchmark communities.
Joe and Dave, I was just taking a brief look at Peter Bogart's letter to us, and 2 out of the 6 communities that he referenced in that attachment, the PDF he had with his report, that being Ann Arbor and Kalamazoo, are showing up on our graph. But 4 of the 6, Meriden, Ingham County, and Oakland County, and basically Kalamazoo County, weren't. I'm not sure if we should take a look. If I remember correctly, there were some correlations relative to size and GDP and things like that.
Right, and I think some of it would, like Kalamazoo County and Kalamazoo Municipality might be somewhat duplicative in some of that regard. But I think
Exactly.
what Joe has done here, these all have been municipalities, just as
Correct.
Holland is a municipality.
Yep.
And so when you look at the kind of breadth of control and in policy implementation,
Mm-hmm.
it's going to line up better if you look at it on a municipality by municipality
Okay.
basis. But I mean, if there are others, we can take a look at that.
Okay.
So are we distinguishing between BPW's, the city it provides power to, and or the surrounding areas like
So all of
CDP?
Yeah. So all of
Is-
the
is-
people and profit metrics, Nikki, for Holland would be metrics that are for the city of Holland.
Just the city, okay.
Yeah, just like this, just like the community energy plan is, really a city of Holland plan. So all of the people and profit section there are going to be metrics that are from city of Holland data, as opposed to the larger metropolitan area.
Thanks.
And I think that would fall with the other municipalities too, in terms of, Joe, correct me if I'm wrong, but they would be, limited to those geographic boundaries to the extent that that's how the data showed it.
That's correct. Yep.
Okay.
Great.
So Joe, do you feel good with like 6 weeks on this?
Yeah, I think that's a great timeline. I feel comfortable with that. The people and profit should fill out fairly quickly. As Keith and Dave mentioned, if there's insights from this group or anything you don't see represented that you want, I can get that added. And then following along through the education pieces and filling that data in as you guys walk through it should work fine.
I was going to say Friday, so if you're going to let you have 4 to 6
Yeah.
Oh, sure.
Travis,
You say that now. You say that now, Travis.
I
All
like-
right.
I like
Were you going to help him, Travis?
He doesn't want my help. He knows better than that.
He wants to get it done fast, Tim.
I think the other thing is that, just to let Joe off the hook too much with this, but I think, having the data in there from what is available is going to be probably fairly easy to get to, especially if these communities are participating in either ICLEI or, the Carbon Disclosure Project and things like that, or other mechanisms where there's more of a public disclosure. There may be others that are going to require a phone call, or discussion with somebody who's in charge of a program in a community. Those might take a little bit longer to get populated, but they'll also have some pretty good information and, through that. And I think what we'd like to do is probably encourage Joe to focus on phone calls for the communities that are most closely aligned, with the city of Holland first, and then we can maybe go from there. But, to make sure that we're bringing back to you the ones that on the people and profit side are the closest aligned.
Yeah, and I wonder too, is it initially my head says it is, but is there some value in an initial blush of Joe showing us this with those who are actually publishing their info versus those who are not? It's interesting to me, like who's doing that and who's not doing that. Is that, I don't know, Dave, I mean, what goes into making the decision of sharing that kind of information or not?
Well, you have to be kind of proactive as a community, say that you're interested in understanding it and working on it. And
So
I think
that to me is an asterisk or something that would be interesting to see, I guess, if you're
yeah.
starting off.
And I guess the question is, Joe, do you know how many of the communities have we kind of started looking at that already based upon who's participating in CDP?
Yeah, I don't have that data, again, not ready for conclusion, but I have been mining through that kind of as the first foray into that planet section. So one of those, just stop sharing my screen, but one of those columns is reporting, and that's looking at the reporting mechanisms they're using. And again, it's a yes, no, or how. So that will be included.
Okay.
Yeah, I would, my 2 cents, I mean, in 4 to 6 weeks or Friday, whatever, all sound great, Joe. Prioritizing the planet section versus adding more new cities, if feels more interesting. I mean, you got a great list there, right? It's like, I don't know, maybe we add more cities down the road, but that planet section is super interesting to see yes, no, maybe in the, like that'll tell us a lot.
That's our third leg.
Yeah.
Yep.
Well, and it just will, it's just all about, regardless of how many people and how many businesses, like, do people have a plan? Do people named goals? Are people doing something about it? That's a big layer. So anyways, good stuff, man. Appreciate it.
To that end, or what has been laid out here is just beautiful. And I could see the ability for us to generate just enormous amounts of data. Should we as a team be thinking about a handful of pretty difficult strategic questions that we think we're going to have to come up with answers for our constituency that we might want to present to other communities for their input?
Give me an example.
One example might be to what extent you want to, does your goals including offset versus direct reduction? I mean, that would be one.
Sure.
To what extent does taking your goal to 0 versus something not quite there mean to you? To what extent do you have certain segments of your constituency pay more for whatever costs than others? I mean, I'm making these things up.
I'm picking up what you're putting down, PJ. I think, like, for Ann Arbor, for instance, like, they got a goal, and then there's like a big plan that they have that you can read. And I think you learn a lot of the answers to some of those questions, but maybe not all of them. So I don't know if that is part of, I think based on the columns I saw, Joe's going to have to get into some of those plans to be able to unearth some of those things. So I think we very well may be in the spot where you're predicting, where we're going to have some follow-up questions. It's a little hard, I think, until Joe does the initial swath of research before we would maybe, that's my initial take, is depends on what Joe finds out if we want to have follow-up questions.
Yeah, I think a lot of that's going to be.
Brian.
Sorry, go
Brian,
PJ.
I agree.
PJ.
Okay. I agree up to that point where is it that we let Joe do work by himself, search and discovery by himself, versus us giving him more directed guidance? And maybe it's an iterative process. Maybe he does this next bit of work, brings back to us, and then we're better armed to ask him more directive questions. But my only reason for continuing to push this is just to really affirm you've got a really high potential study going here. And I would, I'm excited about it. I think we should try to get the most out of it.
Yeah, we're on the same page there. Keith?
PJ, I think you answered your question. I would definitely say it's an iterative process where Joe's certainly finding things out that none of us would know because he's doing the work, but then bringing it back to all of you says, oh, wow, like, I'm really more interested in this. And an example that I would use is kind of a discussion that we've been having, right? Like, name your community. And then overlay that with the presentation that we got from Mike and Ben earlier, and kind of the added complexities of all of that, where there's some that have said, hey, we're doing this, but you peel that back and what you call doing this, right, means a whole bunch of different things. So you might have named something, but it's kind of like, what was the example of I'm still going to eat a cheeseburger every day for the next 20 years versus
last year.
I'm putting myself on a diet sustainably for the next 20 years. And I'm like, there's a big difference between those two approaches. And I think Joe's going to be finding some of that out in his work, and he'll kind of prep us for that. But then that's where really you guys are going to continue to ask those tough questions. So I think we can all see it kind of coming together really nicely.
Yeah. With that in mind, is it worth putting Joe on the agenda in 2 weeks just to see an update of where he's at instead of waiting for 4 to 6 weeks? No pressure. He can just be like, hey, like, I did everything underneath and nothing's different than what you see.
Well, like the cheeseburgers, Joe plans on like waiting until week 5 and 6 days in order to like populate everything. No, I'm kidding, Joe. Sorry.
Yeah, I think I had this right. Joe's a Calvin grad, not a Hope grad like Travis.
Oh, okay.
Hey,
But Jeff would love him as a
love
student
those.
several years ago, I'm sure.
Keith is just throwing caution to the wind, man. You know you're the Holland city manager, right?
Hey, that's all right. You guys been taking shots at me. We're sister organizations. Hope and Calvin love each other.
Yeah, okay.
Next recovery.
To the point, let's put Joe on the agenda for the next time. It doesn't have to be long. It could be be bright, be brief, and be gone. But at least we're up there.
I think that would be great.
Thanks, Joe.
We'll set it up. Joe says he's been attending in the background anyway. So
okay. Oh,
yeah.
we'll give him a
He
chance.
likes the airtime, so we'll give it to him.
It's a step on the ladder.
I'll plan on 2 weeks. If you don't see me next week, I'm hiding from Travis.
I see Travis rubbing.
the only
his
way
head
to get
already.
things done, right, Joe?
Hey, Travis, all that stuff you wanted Joe to do over the next 2 weeks? Count on it.
Yeah. Yeah. I see how this is gonna go.
All right.
I still
All
owe
right.
you a lot, Travis. Like
You forgot me to start the meeting too. My feelings are still hurt.
Yeah. All right, party people. I feel like we just skipped to adjournment unless someone else has a better idea. But I feel like this was good, and we're 5:25.
Can Becky pull up the agenda one last time? I think there's one more thing we want to point out at the bottom, and that's just the dates, just so everybody has it on their calendars. You can see we've added some more meetings now.
Yeah, one.
So we've gotten us through March.
Yep.
And so just so you're planning accordingly for that.
April report delivered to city council, I think is what that says.
Right.
Well, the other thing I was going to point out is that this group does want to make time at some point for more of an intentional public engagement process. So other than people coming and sharing their views, I think that's probably something, I don't want us to mandate it at all, but I think you're going to probably want to do something where you
Community.
create
yeah.
some sessions to get people in, to talk about it.
And if it's, I mean, depending on how our timing goes, that and what happens with COVID, we may want to consider, Brian, we can talk about this, but we could even, if it gets into the warmer season, we could do that outside. So
Cool.
Yeah.
Come to the gazebo at ODC.
yeah,
Yep.
we could. So it just might be a way to handle it, depending on how quickly that comes up. So
Keith's front yard and pickleball court in his driveway.
yeah.
Oh, that's good.
All right.
Okay.
All right.
Well, I vote to adjourn. I don't know what's the formal way to do this.
I always believe the chair can just call the meeting adjourned.
Great. Let it be adjourned. Have a wonderful couple of weeks, everybody. We'll see you on the interwebs.
Thanks.
All right. Sounds great.
Thank you.
Thank you.